asset transfers, or CATs for short, from the legal perspective. As Casey said, we're part of the Charity and Social Economy team at Wrigleys, and I'm a partner, and Caroline's another solicitor in the team. Say good afternoon to everyone, Caroline.
Hello, everyone.
I think let's try and set a little bit of the context. The CATs aren't currently all that common in the CLH sector, and we're looking at this topic today to try and bring together a few of the strands that we do, and obviously CLHFest have got different strands as well. So hopefully we'll touch upon a few of the issues that the sector faces, and try and bring a few of those things together, particularly about how local authorities and the sector can work together. I shall move on to talk about the agenda, what we're going to cover. So first of all, what is a community asset transfer? Then what are local authorities able to do? What transfers can they do? What are they able to grant? Followed by what a typical CAT might look like and how community-led housing can fit into this. And then finally, we'll have a brief touch upon what practical issues might arise, and then we'll be followed by Chris, who will get more in depth into a practical example for you. Okay, so that's what we're going to cover. And without further ado then, Caroline, can you tell us what is a community asset transfer?
Well, that's actually a good question, because there's not actually a statutory definition of a community asset transfer, but it's a phrase that's sort of bandied around quite a lot, and people sort of have in mind what they think it means. Essentially, a sort of working definition would be that it's a process where council-owned buildings, land or assets are transferred to community ownership in some form at less than full market value. Because there's no sort of statutory definition of a CAT, and there's no sort of formal specific legal structure for a CAT either. So sometimes these can be done by way of a freehold transfer. More commonly, they would be by way of a long lease. And often that would be for a term of about 99 years, although that's certainly not set in stone, and we've seen various different examples of different lease terms. It's also important at the outset, so that there's no confusion here, to make clear what a CAT is not. It's not the same as an asset of community value or the community right to bid that some of you might be familiar with. Those rights, those assets of community value, relate to the rights for community groups to bid for the purchase of assets, commonly owned by third-party landowners rather than councils. The main difference there being that's a right to bid to acquire properties at full market value, whereas community asset transfers, the idea is that either it's for nil value or certainly at an undervalue from market cost.
Yeah, absolutely. So the takeaway point here is a CAT is not a type of a legal interest in land, like a freehold or a leasehold interest. It's this generic term or jargon for moving assets from government to local communities, and really it describes the process of doing that. So Caroline, moving on then, can you tell us what local authorities are able to do?
Yeah, and this is an important thing to be aware of as well, because a local authority may be fully supportive of the idea of transferring assets to the local community or to community groups or organisations, but they do act under legal constraints as to what they're actually allowed to do with the land and properties that they own. So the starting point is Section 123 of the Local Government Act 1972. And the overarching rule there is that authorities can only dispose of land at the best consideration reasonably obtainable. So in other words, full market value and essentially the best price that they can extract for that piece of land. unless they get the consent of the Secretary of State for those of us in England, like Tim and myself, or the Welsh National Assembly in Wales. However, the important thing for cats is that there is then sort of underneath that general rule, there is a general consent which permits local authorities to dispose of land at less than market value, provided that the purpose for which the land is transferred is likely to contribute to the promotion or improvement of the economic, social, or environmental well-being of the area. And also provided that the undervalue is not more than £2 million. There are a couple of exceptions to that, and particularly be wary around public open space and playing fields. But the broad gist is that if you fit into those categories of something for the promotion or improvement of economic, social, or environmental well-being, there may well be a chance that the authority can, in fact, make that disposal of land at less than market value.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. I think I saw a couple of names popping up. So I'll just add to the point that Section 123 is the starting point in law. I would add that Section 123 specifically applies to principal councils. If you happen to be from a parish council or a community council, for example, there is the same rule, but it's in Section 127 if you happen to be looking for the specific rule. As Caroline says, you need a specific consent from the Welsh National Assembly or the Secretary of State in England if the undervalue is worth more than £2 million, but you don't need a specific consent below that level if you can fit within the terms of the general consent. I'd also add for some context about this, that these consents and the separate but identical ones for England and Wales were made back in 2003. So these have been around for a long time, and I would hope were well understood, and perhaps they aren't quite as well understood as Caroline and I might hope. But as I say, they've been part of the legal landscape for a long time, and it's a well-trodden path. So that is a brief overview of the starting point from a legal perspective, but let's talk about how this actually gets used in practice. First, by looking at what a cat typically looks like. And first of all, I apologise for my silly slide, but my point here is it's really important to know a community asset transfer when you see one. And you might ask, why is that important? But it's absolutely vital for both the local authority and the community group, the recipient of the community asset transfer, to identify that it is a community asset transfer and ensure that their transaction's valid. Because if the local authority were to act outside of its powers, it could ultimately end up rendering the transaction void. So how can you make sure that your transaction is valid? Well, the first thing, of course, you need to know, is your transaction at best value or at less than best value? So you need to get a valuation report. If you identify from that your transaction is on best value terms, then it's really pretty likely that the local authority can enter into the transaction. For those who are keen on the Localism Act 2011, as I'm sure many of you are, that introduced a general power of competence. So as I say, chances are you'd fit within that and the local authority would be able to do the transaction. This might enable things like the authority accepting a deferred consideration or staged payments, for example, rather than a less than best value transaction. So slightly different focus, different power applies. If you get your valuation and you identify that the transaction is proposed at less than best value, then you need to check the powers that have been used. From the community group's perspective, you'd want to receive a warranty from the local authority that the powers have been validly exercised. Of course, the local authority should ensure themselves that the transaction they're entering into is valid. But from the transferee's perspective, you can't wholly rely on that. or assume that that's happening. So it is really important to check it yourself, ask questions about it from the outset, and get proper legal advice in relation to the transaction and the powers that are being used. And really, my point here is it's best to ensure that your transaction is valid from the start, because you don't want to be in the situation of finding out sometime later that a transaction you thought you had entered into isn't valid and you don't have the right or the interest in land that you thought you did. So my worrisome tales aside, moving on, Caroline, can you tell us what are cats typically being used for?
Yeah, so what people probably have in mind when they think of the various community asset transfer, probably be looking at a building that's already in some degree of community use. So often a town or a village hall is a classic example. Maybe a local library, local leisure facilities, often including services currently run by the local authority. Often, although by no means exclusively, there might already be some sort of informal friends of group or some sort of local volunteer involvement with the building and the activities going on there. And the community asset transfer would effectively sort of formalise that. The friends of or community group would incorporate as a new charity typically. They take on the building and if applicable, often take over running the services that the local authority was running out of that building. Generally that would be by way of a long lease, and that would tend to be the sort of what you might call the typical cat transaction.
Okay, so let's move on then. Can cats include community-led housing?
In legal terms and in principle, yes. It depends somewhat on what your CLH project is, and to a certain extent it depends on whether your own particular authority is going to be supportive of that. I would say that groups that are structured as community land trusts would have a particular advantage in sort of justifying a cat transfer. The statutory definition of a CLT includes a requirement that it's established for the express purpose of furthering the social, economic and environmental interests of the local community. So that fits very neatly within the terms of the general consent. So assuming that there's sort of general agreement about the asset to be transferred in legal terms to fit into the general consent, you're in a pretty strong starting point if you're a CLT. If you're purely setting up, for example, a housing co-op, you might have a bit of a sort of harder job to justify how you'd fit into the CAT process and the general consent regime. The idea is that you need to ensure there's some benefit to the wider community. So you'd need to think about how you frame that argument or make that case, as it were. But in principle, that there are ways and means around that, provided always that you meet these terms of the general consent, that you're furthering either social, economic, or environmental interests of your community.
Yeah, and I think to put that in a bit of context from the authority's perspective, we have to remember, obviously, the authority's perspective into relation to this, because they're not required to do cats. From that perspective, it's important to be able to weigh and analyse the personal benefit that the members of the scheme are getting and balance that against the benefit to the community from the wider perspective. As Caroline says, it's straightforward housing co-ops where all the benefits are being retained by individuals who are members of a scheme, they're more likely to face an uphill battle based on existing community asset transfer policies, or of the typical community asset transfer policies that we see in place at the moment at local authorities. Although again, we have to stress that each local authority has a different policy. I'll just comment on mutual home ownership societies as well, which is a bit of an interesting development, which is a hybrid concept mixing co-op and affordability. And there are two schemes local to our office in Leeds, actually, where they have managed to obtain support from the local authorities. So just mention that one as a positive example of where schemes can be done. Okay, then moving on. Caroline, again, can you tell us how can the groups go about taking advantage of the policies that exist?
Certainly. So as a starting point, it might be worth looking at the local authorities' policies. And I think this may particularly be useful if your authority doesn't have a specific CLH policy in and of itself. And we've seen that quite often these might not be in place yet, but it's much more frequent that a council will have a CAT policy. Now, in general, those are probably envisaging what we've talked about as the kind of typical CAT transfer of a town hall or similar buildings to a community group, but it can still be useful as a sort of starting point to look at the sort of things that they're envisaging supporting, the sort of process that they would like to see followed, and it can certainly be a starting point for discussion. The next point, which is really quite a fundamental one, is think about what properties or what assets are available. It's stating the obvious, but for a community asset transfer to work, there needs to be an asset to be transferred. So think about what land or what buildings your local authority owns, and if necessary, think a bit laterally. So it needn't necessarily either be bare land to be built on, and particularly you might need to consider issues about public open space if it was bare land, but it needn't either be something specifically set aside for housing. We have seen examples of, say, a former school site that could be transformed into a CLH project. So be willing to think a bit outside the box in terms of the properties available and what you might be proposing for a project. And then also think laterally about the proposed terms of the CAT. So we've talked about the kind of typical CAT at a 99-year lease at a peppercorn rent generally. But as we've said, a community asset transfer is not a specific legal structure or form, so it needn't necessarily fall within that structure. It could be a freehold transfer, for example. It could be a freehold transfer where, say, the authority puts certain restrictions on the use to ensure it continues to be used for certain community benefit uses. It could be that they impose some kind of clawback or overage if it's then sold on at a profit to kind of protect the community use, the community value there. Or it could be a long lease, but at slightly different terms or with slightly different conditions to the kind of lease that might typically be envisaged. So there are plenty of options there. So be prepared to sort of think around the possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. I just mentioned, personally, I think a possible area for local authorities, particularly principal authorities, to look at is the possibility of using the planning regime, at least the one that exists at the moment. I'm sure everybody knows that that's about to be radically changed. But there's the possibility of obtaining affordable housing stock, or the levies that traditional developers have to pay in lieu of providing affordable housing, and look at the possibility of transferring those houses or those levies into the CLH sector. The power already exists. Again, this is separate from community asset transfers specifically, but there is a power in Section 233 of the Town and Country Planning Act for them to dispose of the land they've acquired for such purposes. That's a separate seminar topic in itself, but hopefully, again, it demonstrates that local authorities have the power to do things. And sometimes as the sector, we need to help encourage authorities and educate our friends at authorities of the possibilities that do exist, to help grease the wheels, shall I say. Okay, I'm conscious of time. Caroline, should we just touch on a few of the issues that can arise in relation to CAT projects?
Yeah, sure. We've touched already on how these are typically done by way of lease. And that is something that needs to be thought about quite carefully, the issue of tenure. So whether you're getting something freehold or leasehold. If you're planning a long-term housing project, a lease, particularly a lease for 99 years, might not quite be what you need. You might need something longer term or more secure, really. So be careful in what you're thinking, sort of when you're drawing up initial plans as to what you're envisaging happening in really the long term. The fact that a typical CAT might be a 99-year lease doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the most appropriate structure for your project. And then kind of flowing very much from that, there's the issue of fundability. So almost certainly, whatever your project is going to be, you're going to have some kind of development costs, which are going to need funding from one source or another. And that's almost certainly going to involve your funder taking security over that site. And you need to make sure that what you've got is a document or is a structure that's going to be acceptable to your funders. So particularly thinking about term or duration and thinking about the funders' rights in the hopefully unlikely event they need to repossess, but they do need to see their position covered on that. And then finally, be careful in terms of the constraints on the use in the document that you're agreeing. It's certainly not wrong to have considerable constraints in there, and your council might require that to make sure that this is being done as a community project rather than being turned for commercial profit. But make sure that those restrictions fit not just what you're planning at the moment, but fit what might arise in the longer term. So try and think forward to future-proof the terms of whatever documents you're agreeing.
Sure. I think, again, I'd just like to add a slight variance on how we're looking at it there, this time from the perspective of the members of your housing project, the people who own the actual houses, and in most cases, either they or future residents will need to be able to mortgage the properties as well. So again, if you start at 99 years from the local authority for at least to the community ed housing group, then really you don't have that long before housing members are going to start worrying about that 80-year mark where it gets harder to obtain a mortgage for an individual. So I can't say that 99 years is not doable, but it certainly wouldn't be ideal. And really, I think you should be looking at a minimum of 125 to at least give you a reasonable sort of start period before you have to worry about it again. And as Caroline says, we're all trying to play within the regimes that exist at the moment, and sometimes it does feel a little bit like banging your head against immovable objects. But we all need to be aware of that and what we're up against. And I think with local authorities, there's a temptation to sort of put in commissioning type restrictions in the lease terms, whereas instead of making the lease tied up, it's possible for local authorities to use the planning regime, which is less of a concern for funders and for traditional banks. So it's just a different mechanism of achieving the same sorts of objectives for the local authority without causing too many problems for the CLH group. Conscious that we are running over a little bit, so I think we'll stop there. I hope that's been a helpful sort of introduction to the topic of community asset transfers. I hope some questions have come in, and we'll have a look at those and do our best to answer those whilst we hand over to Chris Blake to talk about a practical example.
Great.
I shall try to stop sharing my screen.
Thanks both. That was a really useful insight into some introductions on thinking on community asset transfers. So yeah, delighted now to hand over to Chris Blake from the Green Valleys Community Interest Company. So the Green Valleys Community Interest Company are currently undertaking a feasibility study looking at the possibility of communities managing the landscape that surrounds their towns or village. So we're looking at sort of community ownership of more natural assets. And yeah, this is all about Project Skyline. So really delighted to have you here, Chris. I'm looking forward to hearing all about it. So over to you.
Thanks, Casey. Hope you can hear me. I'll try and keep this quick so we get lots of time for questions. If some of you I know are already familiar with what we're doing in Skyline. If you're not and you'd like more information, then please get in touch. There's much to say. It's a project which has been running for a couple of years, and we're beginning to move through to the final delivery stage, which is pretty exciting. It's about taking the landscape, we're particularly focused at the moment on the landscapes of the South Wales valleys. And actually, this is a picture of the Upper Rhondda taken in probably in the 1950s, a bit hazy, which now looks like this. It's about the transformation. It's about giving communities some stewardship of the public land that surrounds their town. This is the Fernhill Colliery site at the top of the Rhondda, and Blaen Cwm round to the right. That is Welsh Government woodland estate, and you can put it into the capital asset transfer frame, but what it's really is about the transfer of the stewardship of landscape scale assets to community usage. And that's what the Skyline project was about. This is Turbot High Street as it is today, or was a couple of years ago. There's the fish and chip shop, which I have been to many times. And what's interesting, and people live their life up and down that high street with their eyes down on the pavement, but above them is this extraordinary landscape. It's an extraordinary landscape. It's a rich landscape. It's a land which is creating renewable energy, which could grow food, which is growing trees, but which at the moment has no economic, cultural or social connection, or very little, with the community that lives right there. People usually think I've photoshopped that photograph and put it together. I didn't. The feasibility study which we completed tried to answer 4 questions. Do the communities, are they interested in landscape management, landscape stewardship? Are there sustainable business models? And I'm very passionate about this. Capital asset transfer, if there isn't a sustainable business model attached to it, is going to be a problem, because you can't quite soon afterwards, you need more handouts and more cash. And so it's very important that there are sustainable business models that will allow that asset to be maintained for the long term. Can it be done in a way that improves the ecology? Because otherwise we shouldn't be doing it. and what are the governance structures? And then, so very briefly, we worked in 3 communities in the South Wales Valleys, and the answers to those questions were yes, the communities were unsure at first, but at the end of the process were very, very keen and want to go forward with community land stewardship. Yes, there are sustainable business models, but only if you operate at scale. You know, transferring 10 hectares of forest doesn't give enough income or to be sustainable. Yes, there are substantial advantages that can be made to the environmental and ecosystems, and there are some very good governance models. A lot of this evidence from this is coming from Scotland. We took a trip. We took representatives of the 3 communities up to Scotland to visit 3 or 4 of the long-standing community transfer model projects in Scotland. They're different from Wales because in Scotland they have actually been given ownership. There's been a transfer of title with cash given by the Scottish government to enable that. One of the ones we went to was Kilfinnan, where they're operating their own sawmill, community-owned sawmill, and in the top right-hand corner they're building really innovative and fantastic, very low-cost social housing units using timber. It's basically a log construction, a log cabin construction, which doesn't need standard graded timber. So they're using low-cost social housing units, very flexible, with timber, which wouldn't normally be could be used for construction. And that's a better photograph of the house that they've 5 units which they've got, which are costing less than £40,000 each. What Skyline is really about is a transfer of control. It's a transfer from control of the way these things were done in the past to the community taking control over the long term. So although we need a large area, we also need long term. If tree harvesting cycles are measured in 4 or 5 decades, then you need a 100-year control to really see through the vision of what's going on. We did, in getting through the feasibility study, we did a lot of consultation work with the communities. I will say we were helped by some fantastic facilitators who really used a lot of artistic and creative processes. There was a lot of conviviality. We shared food together. We did activities, not the traditional how do you want to see the future, but we started as, this was a photograph from a workshop we were running, remembering what's been lost, what's gone, what is it, and teasing out of that the common values that we have. And that timescale for what's been lost wasn't just the last 20, 30, 40 years. We went back 3,000 years and saw the industrialization as a very small blip in what had been a completely different relationship between community and landscape over the longer term. And that seemed to make the idea of what that a future could be completely different much easier to get people's heads around. And lastly, I am racing through this at enormous speed. Very important to us has been the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, because what in effect we're arguing for here, and it's very similar to what Tim was saying earlier, it's about the multiple benefits. So land which is substantially managed for commercial benefit, although in the public sector, under community stewardship, we can deliver a whole range of multiple benefits from that landscape. And so our projects are about delivering, turning one section of commercial woodland back into a nature reserve and with natural regeneration, about how using timber and processing it locally and using it locally, so that we keep as much money as we can within that local economy, developing the foundational economy, encouraging access, encouraging artistic and social activities in the woodland, giving real responsibility for that, but also to manage the landscape for flood prevention and carbon sequestration. And all of these things didn't always come with sophisticated ecological language. One of my favorite phrases from the consultation was a woman who'd lived in the valley all her life and just said, you know, Chris, what we want is we want less pointy trees and we want more round trees. And that was the language in which he was able to express it, but it said exactly what we were after. On the housing front, what we're doing with the housing front is the plan is, and we've got Foundational Economy Challenge Fund money to set up the land trust over some hundreds of hectares. And that's the process we've started, and we hope to complete by March of next year. We've also got some funding from the Climate Action Fund, the UK Lotteries Climate Action Fund, to develop some of the enterprises around those land-based economy. And what we're planning to do is to develop, working with our partners, RHA, Rhondda Housing Association, to develop using local timber, if we can, which I think we can, to design and build low carbon wooden housing for social or even self-build purposes. So we can really get that local economy going. It'll only be one of the strands that we're doing. We're also looking at controlled environment horticulture project, wood processing, maybe an electric vehicle car club. There are a number of different strands we can bring together. But it's all about re-energizing the community economically and socially around landscape management. That is a very quick rush through. I think it might be easier rather than I can witter on for hours, and literally have done on many occasions, as some of your audience already have heard. So I will stop there, and maybe we can pick up more things in questions.
Great, thanks, Chris. That was a really interesting insight into the project and some of the sort of on the ground practicalities that you're sort of moving through at the minute. So like you said, we've got plenty of time for discussion and questions. So I can see some have been posted in the chat already, so I'll try and sieve through those as well. But yeah, so happy to open up the floor for questions for our speakers, or just any comments on community asset transfers in general. So please feel free to either use the chat, or you can sort of pop your hand up and I'll try and see everybody that wants to come in. So I think we've got a question from Jackie. Do you want to unmute yourself, Jackie?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That's great. I'm really interested in that because it fits in with the ethos for our unit, as you're well aware. But I've got lots of questions I'd ask you, Chris. I'll speak again, but this one I'm really keen on. While we've got people about asset transfers, is about the NHS and the abilities to liaise and try and to have a transfer from an NHS site, and it's causing us a lot of long-term difficulties, I'd say. But you know, it's not insurmountable, and we are a community land trust ourselves. But I'm wondering if there's any precedent been set, or anyone knows any information about transferring site land that was NHS owned.
From a legal perspective, the first thing you need to do is identify which bit of the NHS you're talking about, because it's not all the same. It's obviously is an area that's devolved from UK government to Welsh National Assembly. So the systems in England and Wales are a bit different. And I certainly wouldn't claim to be an expert on the English system, let alone the Welsh system. But from an English perspective, a lot of the land assets, land and building assets, are held by NHS trusts. So they're not local government, and they are held specifically for health purposes. So in relation to land and buildings that are held by an NHS trust, it's difficult to be able to justify anything less than a best market terms transaction. That's a general rule. I can't say that applies in every single circumstance, but that's sort of a general outline. In relation to any NHS land that's held by an actual authority, if land's held by a government department, similar principles as the local government principles we've been talking about do apply, and there are processes that exist in order to request release of land that's not being properly used. It's a variation on the same topic, so it's not the same pieces of law, and it's not the same people you have to approach. And to be perfectly honest, I can't remember the particular reference off the top of my head, but it's something that we could look up, and perhaps we can provide it through Casey, and she can disseminate afterwards.
Yeah, it's the NHS, it's Welsh estates, so so we know it's those who are holding the key, but that'd be really helpful if you wouldn't mind. Thanks.
Yeah, not at all. As I say, there are sorts of processes that can be.
Jackie, I'll just make a general point. Not about, I don't know about NHS land, but it isn't easy working with. The land is owned by the Welsh Government Woodland Estate that we're working at, but it's managed by NRW, and it's not easy. They don't want to do it. It's a change. It's a new way of working. It's risk. It's if they can find a way of not doing it, they will. So it takes quite a lot of pressure and quite a lot of pushing to get there. But we found that the obligations under the Wellbeing Act to look at multiple benefits has been a very valuable lever to do this.
Sophie Howe has been wonderful. She's been really helpful for us. She's actually allowed us a person to help us and assist us with Petrenka, one of the officials from the Wellbeing. So we're evidently aware of that, but it's just pushing against that really tough door.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. That's
and
great.
the risk, and they're scared. They're scared that in 5 years' time they're going to need them to sell it for assets or money, or and so it's not an easy process. They'll be happy to get rid of assets which have no foreseeable value and which may be liabilities for them. They're not so happy to give away assets which have recognisable or potential value. And that's, I
think that comes from the local authority as well, because when I was mayor of Talgarth, we transferred the toilets and the pavilion over, but there was a lot of issues there with regard to making sure that we didn't sign off anything or take over anything until they'd actually done the roof of the pavilion, all the issues that had not been dealt with prior to that. They're happy to get rid of assets that they don't want to work with anymore, but they were easy for us to take over, really, apart from the fact that we gave them a lot of grief on what they had to do for us to take it on in the first place. But that was but this is totally different with the NHS, with the land thing. But I'll have a chat with you again, Chris, if that's okay.
Thanks, Jackie. Any comments from Tim or Caroline on that and that sort of point of the local authority transferring liabilities rather?
Just to yeah, and I think it's a very good point to be aware of the sort of state of repair of the buildings being transferred, and that's certainly something that needs to be factored into your sort of long-term planning. And we've seen community asset transfers where the repairs have been quite a significant, I guess, quite a significant driver of the transaction. And in the case I'm thinking of, there was kind of specific funding agreement to carry out some fairly major structural repairs, which the community group knew about from the outset. But obviously you do need to sort of do your homework so that there might be things that aren't glaringly obvious at the time, but that in your 99 years or your 125 years or however long it may be, could well become fairly significant. So yes, that's a very good point to be aware of that.
Yeah, I'd concur with that as well. And again, I think it's important to recognise that community asset transfer isn't a particular type of legal transfer, legal lease, or anything like that. We do see all sorts of different lease terms done under the umbrella of a community asset transfer, and it's something that varies wildly from local authority to local authority. I think Nottingham, for example, their community asset transfer policy says their starting point is a 5-year lease, and you can imagine that a 5-year lease term is wildly different from a 99-year lease term, or possibly longer. Yes, leases certainly can be complicated legal documents, and there's all sorts of terms in there that you need to be aware of. And it's important to do proper due diligence on any site or any building that you're taking on, whether that's for a peppercorn or whether you're having to pay for it. It's not as simple as assuming that something free or cheap doesn't come with ties. And there are plenty of local authorities who are supportive. I'm afraid there are still quite a few authorities out there who do identify the opportunity to have perhaps de-risk themselves, to try and put it nicely. Again, it's obviously something that central government have been working on, trying to encourage, not just since the Localism Act, but well, for as long as I can remember, really. But it is a slow-moving beast, as with everything in government. So yes, keep fighting, keep your eyes and ears open. You know, keep wise to these sorts of issues, and yeah, be careful before signing on the dotted line.
Thanks, Tim. Matt, did you have your hand up there? I see. Oh, I think you're on mute, Matt.
Hi everybody, I'm Matt Mitchell. I'm a surveyor who advises public sector and not-for-profits in community asset transfer and other areas, particularly leases as well. And I'm just going to reiterate and briefly just some of the things that Caroline and Tim have been saying, that, you know, although, you know, community organisations can go, you know, yeah, hey, we're going to get a property free. Actually, you know, some of these are very end-of-life properties and come with a lot of obligations, and, you know, it's just not like your own house where you put some money aside to do your repairs, etc. You know, these can come with quite considerable problems. And you know, the key message really is to, you know, in these, and I'm going to call them negotiations, but it's, you know, it's this discussion you have with these authorities. Hopefully they'll be very candid with you, and they may share some of their, well, in my area, kind of surveying information, maybe even valuation information about really what you're taking on. And, you know, and that falls to very often the you know, the responsibility, the trustees of the charity, if it is one, who will become, you know, liable for that. So it's very important to, you know, just not assume, oh, we just get the keys at the end of the day, but, you know, advice from people like Wrigleys. There's you know, the Ethical Property Foundation I mentioned in the chats earlier. There's a representative, I think Robert Chapman's in the room here as well. I also do some of that kind of thing. Yeah, and just one other technical thing. You'll often hear about banded around heads of terms for leases, and you know, if you don't deal with them, you think, well, what are those really? And that's very simply a summary of kind of what's been agreed, and it's what every lawyer wants to get hold of, because at that point you can you know, produce a proper lease and know that it's come from an actual agreement between the parties. Okay.
Great, thanks, Matt. It's good to hear and point out some of those support agencies as well out there for people undertaking community asset transfers. We were on a call this morning as part of our morning session, Why Towns Matter, and I think that's one of the points that was picked out mainly was the support available for community groups and organisations actually undertaking these sorts of transfers. So it's good to see some of those agencies being mentioned. So we've got a couple of minutes left, so if anybody has any further questions, comments, or if anybody wants to know more about Project Skyline, so obviously Chris did a bit of a whistle-stop tour, please feel free to ask now. Otherwise we can draw it to a close a bit early, but yeah, just opening up the floor for sort of final questions.
I did get a private question come through about whether the Localism Act applies to Wales, and I'll answer it publicly because it's something that do get asked fairly frequently, and it might be useful to the group. The lawyerly answer is that bits of it apply to Wales and bits of it don't. The key things do apply, so the power of competence and assets of community value and those sorts of things apply across England and Wales. There are specific things in there which relate to Wales only, and there's specific things in there that relate to England only. But hopefully the key things, the things that we're regularly talking to CLH groups about are basically the same.
Great, thanks for that. So I think if there are no further questions or comments, I think I'll probably draw this session to a close. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks to our speakers, Tim, Caroline and Chris. Really, really interesting and insightful to hear all about the sort of practicalities from the sort of legal perspective, but also the sort of visionary side of things from Project Skyline. And I think we'll all be watching your project closely over the next couple of years, Chris, and keeping an eye on what you're getting up to up the valleys to see what's going on. It's really inspirational, I think, and hopefully more communities and organisations will be doing similar things across Wales over the next couple of years. So just to close, a little plug for our further sessions this week. So we've got 2 more sessions as part of our community-led housing festival. One tomorrow morning on regenerating rural communities at 10 o'clock. With a couple of organisations across Wales speaking about how they are working with rural communities to make them more sustainable. And then we've got a session specifically on community-led housing and some projects across the UK that are really taking the lead on regenerating their communities, and the actual local people are the ones doing it and taking the lead. So please keep an eye out on our social media and our website for those sessions, and you're more than welcome to join us as always. But thank you very much again to our speakers. Thank you for everyone that's attended. Like I said earlier, it's very sunny in South Wales today, so I'll let you get on with your days and go and enjoy the sunshine. So thank you very much and see you all soon. Diolch yn fawr.
Hi, Casey. Any chance of speaking to Chris Blake?
Hi Tracy, so I think Chris is gone, but what I can do for you is get you his email address and put you in contact that way, if that works for you.
Yeah, I've got his Chris. I've spoken to a colleague of his, Ian Thomas, and I'm due to visit Welcome to Our Woods, their hydro project up there, which works along sort of underneath the Skyline project.
Okay.
But I was keen to sort of what I'm trying to work on is a link between the 2 projects. So in order to give evidence to a meeting that you know about that I've got with, it's next week on the 8th, and I've got to send in firm up and show Giselle this